over again with the integumentary system and go from there. So as we know, this integumentary system is made up of the skin and all of its related structures, as we say, the skin, and derivatives, which are those related structures, those structures that we're going to find within the skin, contained within the skin. For example, sweat glands, oil glands, hairs, and nails. If you remember, we did start talking about the functions of the skin, and we said that there were 5 functions, protection being the first. Everything else on this slide is going to be instances that are related to how the skin is protective, and we'll move on from there. It acts as a physical barrier to microorganisms. By microorganisms, we mean viruses and bacteria, things of that nature, and it acts just like what you think a physical barrier is going to do. It acts like a wall. It acts as a protective layer to prevent the ability of those microorganisms to enter your body. Glands are present to produce acid. Bacteria specifically have a very narrow range of pH where they can flourish, where they're really happy growing. And by having these glands produce an acid, it makes the surface of your skin have a slightly acidic pH, which microorganisms, again specifically bacteria, are not happy growing in. So by having this pH being acidic, it prevents or limits the bacteria that can in fact grow on your skin. It acts as a selectively permeable barrier. We know that means that certain things are allowed to pass across this barrier to either enter or leave your body. It protects against abrasions. Remember from our first lab, when we looked at our slides of tissues, if we think about stratified squamous epithelium, we'll remember that it was layered. That was the really major characteristic of that tissue. Those layers allow it to protect your body, the deeper layers of your body, from abrasion, where we just scrape off the upper layers of the stratified squamous epithelium. Hair and melanin protect against UV radiation. The deeper the pigment, the darker the skin tone, if you will, the more melanin that's built up, and it gives more protection against ultraviolet radiation. And the presence of hair just simply acts kind of as a cover so that the sun cannot hit the underlying skin that's below the hair. Next, we have temperature regulation. So temperature regulation is going to be the second major function of the skin. We have a lot of blood vessels in your skin, and they have the ability to constrict or dilate. To constrict means to get smaller, to dilate means to get larger. So when your body needs to retain heat, the blood vessels close to the surface in the skin will constrict to restrict how much blood can get there, because we don't want the blood to dump heat out into the environment. When you're hot, when you've been working out, these same blood vessels dilate, they get bigger, so more blood goes to the surface. That's why when you're exercising, you kind of look flush, because we're dumping a lot of that blood to the surface so that we can get rid of some of that heat. Also, when there's an excess of heat in the body, when the temperature increases in your body, sweat is produced. And again, you got to remember, sweat being produced isn't what cools the body. What cools the body is when the sweat is put onto the surface of the skin and it evaporates. That evaporation helps to cool the body. Erecti pili causes hair to stand up. The tiny little hairs that we have on our body will rise when the body is cold. It sounds kind of dirty, erector pili, when in fact it's simply just goosebumps. So we have this really kind of sad little hairs standing on end to try to trap warm air close to our bodies. If you think about a dog or a cat, it works really, really well. But since our hair is on our body is very, very limited, it doesn't do a whole lot to help keep us warm. But that's the point. Our third function is vitamin D production. We need vitamin D to help our bones stay strong and in good working order. The precursor molecule to vitamin D must be exposed to ultraviolet radiation. Well, first off, what is a precursor molecule? Precursor is simply the molecule that you need to have in order to be able to make vitamin D. So in order to make vitamin D, This precursor molecule, this pre-molecule, has to be exposed to sunlight in order for it to be converted into vitamin D, which your body needs for good bone health. Our fourth function is sensation. Your skin is well supplied with sensory receptors. That's how your body knows if there's a change in temperature in the environment, if something's touching you, if you're leaning against something, because you have these sensory receptors. They're bringing information from your environment into your body so your body knows what's going on the outside. And fifth is excretion. Excretion is getting rid of waste. We do that through producing sweat. Yes, we use sweat to help cool our body, but it also helps to get rid of waste. Sweat primarily is made up of water, but it's also going to contain sodium chloride. We know that sweat tastes salty. We've all tasted sweat at one point or another, and we know that it has a salty flavor, and that's why, because it has sodium chloride contained within. It also contains urea, ammonia, and uric acid. Hopefully, you might have heard of urea, ammonia, and uric acid. They are major components of urine. So in fact, we are excreting, we are getting rid of waste when the body is sweating. When we talk about our skin structure, we're going to be able to identify 3 layers. The outermost, the most superficial, to use our directional terms, the most superficial is the epidermis. The prefix epi means above, upon, around, and that makes sense if this is in fact the outer layer. The epididymis, is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. Those layers and layers of what I refer to as shingle-like cells, really flattened out cells that work as a barrier from the outside environment to the inside of your body. The epidermis is avascular. When we put A in front of a word, that negates it. That means no. So avascular means that this tissue, the epidermis, is not vascular. It does not contain blood vessels. So if you scratch the epidermis, you're not going to bleed. If you do bleed, that means that you went deeper than the epidermis and hit the dermis, the layer deep to the epidermis. This layer is made up primarily of dense connective tissue. It contains blood vessels, nerves, glands, and smooth muscle. It contains all kinds of things that your epidermis is going to need to function and that your body needs to protect itself. Deep to that is the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous level. Hypo means below. So epi is above the dermis, then we have the dermis, and then we have the hypodermis, which is below the dermis. It's not technically part of the skin, and you might think, well, then why are we talking about it? Because it has a very, very important function when we talk about the skin, and that is to keep the skin on your body, to attach that skin to the underlying tissue of muscle and bone. The hypodermis is where the nervous and vascular supplies for the skin pass through. It makes sense. Our blood vessels are going to be deep in our body. We need to have the blood vessel reach the nutrients and such from the blood, reach the upper layers. So we're going to have blood vessels pass through the hypodermis to get up to the dermis. It's made up of loose connective tissue, collagen, and elastin. Hopefully elastin, the word, is going to make you think of a word that sounds very similar to that, and that is elastic. And elastic has a stretchy kind of a property about it. And that is what allows your skin to stretch and go back into shape. As individuals age, I wouldn't know anything about this, but what I'm told is as individuals age, the collagen and elastin start to break down. So that's why older folks might have wrinkles or saggy skin, because that elastin isn't there to kind of bounce back and pull things back where it belongs. We're also going to find about half of the body's fat reserves located in the hypodermis. And if you think about, again, our first lab, when we looked at the locations for adipose tissue or fat, it was subcutaneous fat. That's what we're talking about here, is that layer of fat that's right below the skin that does in fact assist with thermoregulation, with temperature regulation, to keep, it acts as a, insulation, if you will. So here's a kind of a good diagram that shows us our three sections: our epidermis, the most superficial layer, our dermis, and you can see that there are red and blue lines. Those are representing our veins and arteries, our blood vessels. You look in the hypodermis, it looks kind of a bubbly yellow. That is that subcutaneous adipose tissue. That's the fat that we're talking about. This is kind of a neat photograph of the stratified squamous epithelium. You're able to see in the deeper purple area towards the top the layers that we're talking about. And if you look way up at the top, they look kind of flaky, like they're going to fall off, and that's what they want to do. That's the purpose of having those cells in place, because they are going to have the ability to slough off, to prevent against the lower layers of cells from being damaged. This is an interesting photograph that a student sent me, I think it was last year. This lovely woman thought it would be a good idea at a zoo to try and pet, I think it was a panther. And you see what she got for her efforts, a nice gash in her forearm. The reason for this picture is, if you look carefully, because it's kind of gruesome, I realize, but if you look carefully, you can see that there's that bubbly yellow texture to that inside of the cut. And that is, in fact, the adipose tissue bubbling out. So this laceration, this cut, went so far deep as to hit the hypodermis. There are three main types of cells that are going to make up the epidermis, that outermost layer that we talk about. First, we'll identify melanocytes. And if you look at the word, it should make you think of melanin. And melanin is the pigment that we have in our hair and skin that causes some of us to have a deeper, darker skin tone and some of us to have a lighter skin tone. These melanocytes are in charge of manufacturing that melanin. We have Langerhans cells. They are active in the immune system. If we were together, my question to you would be, why would I want to have cells that are active in the immune system located in the epidermis? I'll give you a minute to think. The reason is, we want to have an early alert system, if you will. If the skin's function is to act as a barrier, we want to ensure that that barrier is functional. Well, sometimes it's not. Sometimes there's a nick or a cut or some kind of a problem with it that will allow a microorganism in. If we have these Langerhans cells present, they are going to act as an early alert system. We have immune cells right there on the ground, right where those bacteria might be entering, that will cause an immune response and to help to keep the body protected from these interlopers. And last but not least are the keratinocytes. They're the major type of cell that we're going to find in the epidermis. They produce keratin. Keratin is a protein. Protein is crucial in how the epidermis does its job. It gives the cells the structural strength and support necessary to act as that tough barrier. We sometimes don't think of our skin as that tough, but it really and truly is. And the reason it is because of the keratin that is built up in it. If you think about the names of many skincare products, especially moisturizers and lotions, oftentimes there is some part of keratin in the name. That's because it's playing to the importance of keratin in the upkeep of our epidermis. Mitosis, or cell division, is going to occur at the deepest layer of the epidermis. Old cells are going to desquamate or slough off. The old cells are towards the top of this photomicrograph. Those ones that we mentioned look flaky earlier. They're just going to kind of slough off. They're going to just kind of fall off to allow the underlying cells to be protected. As the cells move to the surface, they go through a series of changes in structure, shape, and chemical composition. So we've used this analogy before. It kind of acts as a conveyor belt. New cells are formed at the deepest layer, and each time cell division occurs, those cells move up a layer continuously until they reach those flaky looking cells that are going to slough off. This process is referred to as keratinization.